Hello and welcome to yet another edition of A Page from History. I am Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay. In this program, we pick out a landmark anniversary of a very significant episode in history and talk about its backdrop and implications. At no point of time do we intend passing a verdict on history or on any of the key players. Over the next 1 hour, we will discuss an event that completely changed the world that we live in. There was a time when the world was always on tenterhooks because of superpower rivalry. On the one hand, there were communist countries bound by the Warsaw Pact, and on the other side, there were Western nations led by the United States. The Cold War that was waged by these blocs against each other for 4 decades kept everyone on the edge. Hostilities between the nations still remain, and the world is nowhere near being a peaceful place. But one lurking fear, that of superpowers clashing at any point of time, appears to have faded somewhat. All this has happened greatly because of a sequence of events exactly 20 years ago in the city of Berlin. For 4 decades, the Berlin Wall had existed as a symbol of Iron Curtain between the countries led by the Soviet Union on one side and the Western Bloc on the other. But in the autumn of 1989, developments in what was then East Germany or the German Democratic Republic triggered a chain of events that ended not only with the end of the Cold War, but also with the eventual disintegration of the Soviet Union. Things also changed for India, wedded as it was to non-alignment. The fall of the Berlin Wall is probably one of the most significant episodes in contemporary history. Joining me today in the studio is a panel of eminent experts who played their professional roles to perfection as history was being unfolded in Berlin and in the former Soviet Union. We have Mr. Rajiv Sikri, a former Indian Foreign Service officer who spent years handling Russia, Soviet Union and that entire block of countries which we are talking about today. Professor Anuradha Chenoy, School of International Studies in the Jawaharlal Nehru University, a very veteran watcher of the Soviet Union, Russia, the entire block of that. Finally, we have Nandan Unnikrishnan, Senior Fellow in the Observer Research Foundation and a former Bureau Chief of PTI in Moscow. Rajiv Sikri, I'll begin with you. Berlin Wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall is considered to be a symbol of a lot of things that happened.
Yeah.
Why was it of such important symbolic value?
I think there are a couple of reasons. I put the fall of the Berlin Wall on par with the French Revolution of 1789, the end of an era, the end of an epoch and the beginning of something else. It signified, of course, the end of the Cold War. It signified the demise of the idea of communism, the ideology which dominated the 20th century. If there was one idea which dominated the 20th century, it was the idea of socialism, communism.
Right.
So that got discredited. And then, of course, the inability of the Soviet Union to stand up to the United States as an equal. So all these equations changed, and with the fall of the Berlin Wall, you had this period of triumphalism, the so-called unipolar world, the rhetoric about the end of history.
Right.
But I said I've compared it with the French Revolution of 1789. Now, just as the French Revolution of 1789 ushered in a quarter century of disorder, conflict, war, leading to ultimately the Congress of Vienna and a new world which emerged in 1815, so I believe the Berlin Wall, falling of the Berlin Wall, has ushered in this period of disorder in the international community, in world affairs. And I think the new kaleidoscope is just being formed. It may take another few years, 5 years, 10 years, I don't know what it would be. But I think when we look back at it from a historical perspective, that will be the significance, that it signified the end of one old order and the beginning of the construction of a new world order for the 21st century.
Anuradha, if we go back to those years, months just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, there had been several other events, in what was then, the East European, communist countries. There had been developments in Hungary, there had been developments in Poland. The Solidarity had formed the first ever non-communist government. Why, despite all these things, does Berlin Wall have so much of significance?
I think you're right in the sense that ever since Gorbachev took over the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and he ushered in reforms of perestroika and glasnost, and also of not really intervening too hard in East Europe, unlike the earlier regime, and allowing some kind of democratic processes to initiate themselves. That set forth a whole lot of new ideas and organizations in many of the Central and East European countries. There was this very strong trade union movement in Poland, Solidarity, as you talk about it, which was against the regime. And this time the Soviet Union did not send in its tanks to suppress it. Similarly, in Hungary, there were opposition movements which were rising. In other places, there were critiques of the regime, of the authoritarianism, of the lack of transparency. There was an urge from writers and intellectuals, and those dissent movements were not clamped down upon. But why the Berlin Wall is more significant is because, as Ambassador Sikri said very rightly, it signified an iron curtain between the bipolar blocks, between the world of communism and the world of capitalism. The clash of ideologies, the clash of two strong militaries, the eyeball to eyeball confrontation of massive nuclear weapons and power. And there was and it was symbolic in the Berlin Wall. So once that collapsed, it became a kind of a symbolic step that now the rest of the communist world is going to follow. And sure enough, 89 the Berlin Wall collapsed, and by end of 1990, 91, the Soviet Union itself declared itself as disintegrated.
Right. Nandan, Anuradha was talking about that the Soviet Union did not send tanks to Poland or to Hungary to suppress the movement. So, there was a very conscious effort on the part of the Soviet leadership of that time to move away from what is called the Brezhnev doctrine, in terms of leaving the East European nations to manage their internal affairs. Do you think that this was partly rather to a great extent responsible for the developments in East Europe?
Well, yes, absolutely. I would tend to agree. After all, the coming down of the Berlin Wall, however much people would like to depict it after the event as some spontaneous happening, it wasn't spontaneous. It was a negotiated settlement, as it were. It was negotiated between Gorbachev and the US leadership that he would not interfere, that German reunification would be allowed, that the NATO would not expand eastwards. I mean, there was a whole architecture that was agreed upon at that period of time. It's a different matter that as we view history today, none of that has really been fulfilled, and the Soviet Union itself has disintegrated. Yes. But undoubtedly, it's my opinion that this was not a spontaneous event, but a negotiated settlement.
Anuradha, if we go back, to the Berlin Wall we're talking about, let's go back to the beginning of the Berlin Wall, years after, the Second World War, when, the entire process, by and large, the bulk of the people, in India as far, have really not been, able to understand that what is the significance of the Berlin Wall when it existed and when it fell.
Well, you see, in the Second World War, the Soviet Union and the United States and the Western countries were allies against fascism. However, this alliance broke down very fast because when Churchill was delivering a lecture in one of the universities in the United States in early 1951-52, he said that now the new threat is communism, and he said there is now a Cold War. The hot war period of the Second World War is over, and now there is a Cold War between capitalism and communism. And in response to that, Stalin said that there would be an Iron Curtain by 1953. With that, things started escalating. Stalin said that the two systems cannot coexist. They are mutually contradictory, they are antagonistic, and the victory will be only when there is one system over the other. And he said it would be a victory of socialism over capitalism. And that translated into a Cold War in the West, but in the East, in countries like Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Korea, Cambodia, etc., there were these regional conflicts backed by two opposite sides. On the one side, by US forces backing pro-United States governments or regimes or groups, and the Soviet Union supporting those which were for communist regimes, as we saw in North and there was a division of North and South Vietnam, etc. So this kind of thing kept escalating, and in that context there were also intelligence wars. The CIA and others trying to get information because of this Iron Curtain about the Soviet Union, to what level of development they had reached, especially military development, and the KGB and others getting information from the West. And in that context, this Berlin was divided into East Berlin, which would be under the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, and West Berlin under the sphere of influence of the US. The American army was there for years, and in that context, the Berlin Wall was actually constructed, very, very a physical barrier not to allow people, especially immigrants who were trying to go across the border and move away from the communist regime into the West, to forcefully stop them. The Berlin Wall was really constructed.
Mr. Sikri, very briefly before we go in for a break, when the crisis happened in East Germany or in other communist countries there, do you think that this was primarily because of the political, feeling of the people, for greater freedom, or was it because of economic crisis?
I think Nandan has accurately said that it was a negotiated thing. I happened to be in Delhi and I was dealing with this region at that time. And it was with a sense of wonderment that, what was happening. But the fall of the Berlin Wall was a bit unexpected, actually. I don't think that everyone thought
you really anticipated it in the foreign desk in Delhi?
No, I don't think that we felt that we saw it coming, but the implications were so profound that nobody really believed that this was going to happen. But then Mr. Gorbachev was a person of a different bent of mind. He talked about this new thinking, and maybe he honestly thought that this is the way that he is going to coexist with the West, become part of a civilized country, a common European home. I mean, that was his vision, and he did not want this bloodshed. So he did not send in the truth.
We'll talk about Mr. Gorbachev in the next segment. This discussion will continue after a short break. In the coming section, we will talk about experts, with our experts, to take stock of the Gorbachev years and evaluate the role played by the man himself. Welcome back to A Page from History. We are talking about one of the most important episodes in world history, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Nandan, Mr. Sikri was talking about, Gorbachev, that it was possibly, Gorbachev allowed it to come. Let us try to understand Gorbachev, the man, his policies, possibly one of the most important characters, who influenced politics of that period, Can you just tell about Gorbachev?
Well, one is Gorbachev, apart from his vision, which was radically different from his predecessors, the fact is he inherited a country which was going through a major crisis. The Afghan war was definitely bleeding them economically, but it was also creating social tensions. The same effect that you have of bodies arriving in the United States, that same effect was taking place in Russia. You had the mothers of these soldiers demonstrating for the first time. They would come out on streets calling for withdrawal of forces. So here comes a man who's taking a country which is going through throes of crisis, and he presumably felt that if he could reduce some of the tensions with his main antagonists, he would be able to deal with the situation internally. I mean, he turned out to be absolutely wrong in his calculations, but I think that is what motivated these reforms that he tried to pursue.
Do you also agree with what Nandan is saying, that he possibly turned out to be wrong? His gamble, he was not successful in his gamble.
Well, in a sense that I think he didn't plan his reforms correctly. Gorbachev, after all, he came at a period of severe economic stagnation. There was, some people in fact were calling the Soviet Union a third world country with a military and nuclear arm. So there were consumer shortages. There were urgings for people were very critical of the kind of authoritarianism of the Brezhnev regimes. So his ideas were very good, of democratization, of de-ideologization, of new thinking, etc., of bringing in a market, introducing a market economy. But he didn't really have an agency of reform, and he kept shifting from one reform to another. For example, he began with the anti-alcohol campaign. That was a disaster because the state lost huge amounts of revenues. So in a year he dropped that and went to another program evolved by Abolkin and others about changing the economy. That didn't stop help the consumer sector at all. Then he shifted to the 500-day plan. Then, so he kept shifting his economic reform strategy, and at the same time, these became mere slogans, yelling about the market, but no market was really evolving. There was no clear privatization. The economy was not delivering. And then he himself, he introduced steps for democratization. He changed the constitution, but he himself didn't stand for elections. So Yeltsin and others stood for elections. They got they swept, and a lot of the members of the Communist Party and mayors of Moscow, etc., lost. And they got more legitimacy, and Gorbachev actually got delegitimized as a leader of the entire Soviet Union. At the same time, nationalist movements arose, especially in the Baltics, in Ukraine, Georgia, and even some parts of Central Asia. Though the Central Asian nationalist movements didn't ask for independence, these others were asking for autonomy and almost declaring sovereignty.
Mr. Sikri, two biggest words of the Gorbachev era, perestroika and glasnost. To a great extent, highly mystified words. If one tries to demystify it, what does it mean?
The first is glasnost, which means openness. That it was a very secretive society, so he said you must open up. It's a bit like our RTI, that you must have a little more glasnost. Perestroika is to rebuild, reconstruct. Mr. Gorbachev, based on his experience as a young person and as a communist leader who grew up in the system, came to the conclusion that it was going to be impossible to do the economic reforms unless the party was restructured. He was probably right in that. But where he misjudged was that the CPSU was not just any party. It was also the administrative mechanism of the state. So when the party lost its monopoly of power, the administrative structure also collapsed. That was one important mistake that he made. The second, I think, was that under glasnost, they began, excoriating themselves, breast beating, we did this was wrong, that kind of opening the old wounds. And when the movement for independence started in Lithuania, by itself a very small and seemingly insignificant country, it was they did not stop it. They in fact encouraged it, and they thought they would lance this boiler. I don't know what they thought, but it was like the unraveling of a sweater. You started pulling, and then the whole fabric unraveled. That is what happened. However, I think that Mr. Gorbachev is probably more reviled than he deserves to be, and perhaps a couple of decades from now, maybe even by 2050, when historians sit down and write about the history of the Soviet Union, that they will be able to assess Gorbachev properly, because he accomplished something which is very difficult. He destroyed the old system. Now, if you look at history, there are very few people who can both destroy the old and create a new.
Okay.
But before you create a new, you had to destroy this fossilized system.
Right.
That is what Mr. Gorbachev did.
Nandan, when you in fact went to Moscow, as the bureau chief of PTI, there possibly this process of breaking down of Soviet Union had happened. Did you get the feeling that this entire process of the disintegration of the Soviet Union could have been prevented if things had been handled in a different manner in those years preceding it?
Well, yes, definitely. But as Rajiv just pointed out, you see, the moment you started dismantling the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, you were ridding Soviet Union of the skeleton that kept it together. It was the CPSU that functioned in Lithuania, Georgia, and all these republics that actually kept them together as one entity. So, in retrospect, yes, you can say that. Just for the purpose of sort of drawing an analogy, if they went the Chinese way, let's say, they reformed the economy first and then started the political reform. Maybe they would have succeeded in keeping Soviet Union together. But the issue, I think, is a little deeper than that. The fact is that when history relooks at or tries to attempt to assess the role of Gorbachev, I am not as sanguine as Rajiv is that he will get too many positive points, because to me, actually, he signifies, particularly when I saw what I saw in 91 to 93, when the suffering of an average Soviet and then subsequently Russian or Kazakh or Georgian, as the republics broke up, people, I think they did not deserve it. Whatever the politicians felt about the system, but the kind of shock therapy that was at that stage, propagated by Jeffrey Sachs and company and then implemented by Yegor Gaidar, I think the Soviet people didn't deserve it. And as a result, I think their hatred for Gorbachev, and by the way, not only for Gorbachev, for Yeltsin too, but for different reasons, is probably, in my opinion, to that extent justified.
Anuradha, after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, Russia emerged as the natural successor state of the Soviet Union. Now, despite having played such an instrumental role, in the Soviet Union as the last president and general secretary of the CPSU, why is it that Gorbachev, could not actually find a political role for himself in Russia?
I think he'd outlived his role. Yeltsin and that his group, Gaidar and others, had taken over. They banned the Communist Party. People were also critical of the way Gorbachev had failed to deliver. And Russia, the new Russia, while it became the successor state, the people of Russia had a lot of structural problems. The shock therapy made Russia from almost a classless society into a very class-divided, fractured society. The price of bread, for example, was doubling every second day. The price of ordinary things became so high. The pensioners, the women, the old people, they had become completely excluded and marginalized.
80% of the population went below the poverty line.
Exactly. And the inflation was something like 250 to 300%. If you see the inflation from December 1991 and January 1992, it was like 380%. The ruble, they had to cut down the zeros. The value of the ruble to the dollar, which was something like first 28 rubles to a dollar, became 3,000, 2,000 rubles to a dollar. There was a black economy. There was a massive outflow of money from Russia. So the economic crisis was such, and it lasted for almost 10 years until Putin came in.
And then started putting
that
things
there was a lot of blame on both Gorbachev and Yeltsin.
Mr. Sikri, you went to Kazakhstan as our ambassador, you're the first ambassador. What did you find there? How was, a new nation emerging, and what was the reaction of the people?
I think Kazakhstan and the other Central Asian republics never really wanted independence. They were among the last to declare their independence because they were so integrated with Russia. It's a very centralized economy. And Kazakhstan in particular its whole economy depended on the military industrial complex. You had the nuclear sites, the military testing sites, you had the space launching things, you had many towns which came up only because of the integrated military industrial complex and the nuclear weapons which were there. So when the country broke up, Soviet Union broke up, a lot of towns and cities completely were destroyed. They became ghost towns. I saw some myself, you know, that there used to be 20,000 people there, now completely like a ghost town. So the process of adjustment was very wrenching, and also they did not have the experience, they did not have the administrative structures, they did not have the personnel. So the early years were very traumatic and difficult for them, and their focus was on somehow preserving their sovereignty, their nationhood, and of course they were very closely linked to Russia because there was no getting away. Over the years, of course, they have diversified their economy and their foreign policy and acquired self-confidence, but the early years were very difficult for them.
We will come back after a short break. In the next segment of A Page from History, we will try to understand the Cold War and what has changed in the world after it ended. Welcome back to A Page from History. We are talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the wall that not only divided a city but acted as a symbol of global division. Nandan, if we go back, you know, to the years, you know, everybody talks about the Cold War, you know, that the Cold War ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, how did the process start? The process of the end of the Cold War must have begun, you know, earlier. You know, it started from the Gorbachev era. Initially, you know, the reaction of United States was very lukewarm to the steps Gorbachev was taking. Can you tell us about, you know, how the US responded in the initial years?
No, as I said earlier, I mean, I can only repeat this, that the fall of the Berlin Wall was part of a negotiated kind of settlement that the USSR and United States were trying to arrive at. Given that the USSR felt that they were overextended, they were not able to anymore economically act as the bulwark that supported the Warsaw Pact, having bled to a large extent economically in Afghanistan. In addition, their own system economically was going through a crisis. They were not able to sustain themselves. So the US wanted to pull back, but at the same time, Germany was a divided country. Right. I mean, there was East and West. So if you did not negotiate your pullback, you could have had a situation where there could have been strife. And the credit goes in that sense to Gorbachev, that he managed the transition without any real loss of life. There was no violence in any of these countries. I'm not talking of sporadic skirmishes, maybe with two groups of people, but as nations, all of them transferred and transformed to their new avatars, as it were, in a politically relatively painless way. But again, to come back to the original point I made, this would not have been possible if the Soviet Union decided that it was not going to negotiate.
Can I just add a brief point here? I think if you notice, even today, the Germans have a soft corner for the Russians. Among all the Europeans, the Germans are most sympathetic and understanding of the Russians.
Absolutely.
Because they know that had Mr. Gorbachev and the Russians not behaved the way they did, there would have been no peaceful reunited Germany. And I don't think they've forgotten it, nor have they forgotten that Russia historically has been their nemesis. For Hitler, certainly it was.
Right.
So all these factors, I think, explain a bit of the complex Russia-German relationship, including the psyche.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, true.
You know, Anuradha, if we try to take the story a bit forward, you know, after the Cold War ended, you know, what really started happening? You know, how did the world change? You know, there were all kinds of social scientists, you know, Fukuyama's end of history theory came up, you know. So what, you know, trying to explain, you know, what changed in the world after the disintegration